Hello, the content this week is about class transitions in education, or why the education system does not solve class inequality, it makes it. So as usual, I'm going to split it up into three separate videos. So the first one, I'm just going to individually by myself give a little bit of a primer and reminder about youth transitions, particularly the school to work transition stuff, and a little bit about kind of conceptual ways to understand how that's been analysed in youth studies over the past couple of decades. And then in part two, Matthew Bunn's going to join us to talk about research that we've done about how the university is actually a thing that produces class as much as kind of any of the mainstream ideas as it somehow addresses it. And then part three, talk to Ben Lohmeyer about the work that we did together based on some of his research on bullying in schools, particularly the way that teachers sometimes bully students. So to get on with it, part one is on youth transitions. So as I mentioned much earlier in the course, youth transitions has been a key area of youth studies. That kind of notion that youth is this kind of liminal period between child and adult. And a particular concern recently has been the way the field itself has kind of pointed out that much of the findings of the research that we do points out that those markers of adulthood are happening later and later and later in life, if at all. So starting to question about the very concept of youth, what it means. Is it more of a kind of affective, figurative thing as much as this kind of, developmental transitional period between child and adult? This also kind of gets us to start to critically analyze what it means to be an adult in society today, with many of these traditional markers aren't happening or difficult to achieve or look like, I suppose, the markers of adulthood from a previous generation. So in this week's work, we're more looking at the kind of school to work, specifically the area of transitional research. So there's been a bunch of different ways to conceptualize this, and up until about maybe even 10 years ago now, the reflexive modernity theorists kind of dominated the ways of thinking about the social changes that were affecting young people's lives and prolonging these transitions. Notions of risk society, that the key organizing principle of society today is risk rather than class. Much of the kind of notions of development and progress of modernity are being challenged by what's happening today with large-scale risks like climate change and terrorism and genetically modified food and artificial intelligence and all these kind of things that seem to threaten the very existence of humanity. It means for the likes of Beck, for instance, that we live in this much more uncertain, precarious ontological state. We're kind of anxious about our futures. And as individuals, and this is kind of relates to individualization, we're forced from an early age to choose our own path. You've got to choose your career like in kindergarten or something now and make all the right choices to put that in place. Relates to notions of detraditionalization, how we kind of think about the way that there's been some social progress around things like feminism, for instance, that have allowed more women into the workforce and into higher education. And this kind of gives us the feeling of more choice in many ways, but really things like class and gender and race still have an obvious effect on notions of inequality and the way people have opportunities and life chances. So there's this kind of juxtaposition with the kind of ideology of being more free to live out your own life and make your own choices, and the reality of those things. And so again, from this perspective, this promotes this kind of reflexivity. You've almost got to kind of step outside your own body and kind of make judges on yourself and improve yourself and, get the right degree and try and pursue the right partner within these constraints. So reflexivity here happens as an individual. You kind of got to be reflexive about yourself and make judgments about yourself, kind of treat yourself as a kind of walking CV. But it also happens on a much more structural level in terms of the risk society thing that, much of the way politics works today, even the way the science works, needs to address the risks that, previous generations or previous things have produced. So society itself needs to be reflexive about its own risks. In terms of that reflexivity at individual level, the likes of Giddens talks about the need, that kind of quest that we all have for this ontological security in this kind of world where we feel precarious and anxious, and even kind of relatively privileged people feel like that as well. We kind of need to make choices and try and strive for this kind of avoiding existential angst and trying to make ourselves secure, both physically and in terms of mental health. So this notion of kind of narrative of the self relates to that. You kind of got to plan out the life, and try and put your choices into place to achieve your ontological security. This also relates to kind of notion of ambivalence, and ambivalence is kind of plays out, I think, in what we looked at in previous weeks around the notions of things like reflexive complicity, where there's like acknowledgement of the problems, and that things need to be kind of addressed, but really it's really difficult for many individuals to kind of do stuff about it. So it kind of leads to kind of a bit of stasis and inactivity when it comes to addressing large-scale social changes. So why has all this happened? Well, particularly, these theories kind of correlate to globalization processes. The kind of world and borders have opened up, but this has kind of led to kind of forms of domination of some cultures and countries over others, some ways of life over others. So it resulted in a bunch of kind of push-pull factors in terms of the way that people move around the world. And this obviously relates to kind of huge, large-scale inequalities. There's been kind of progressive social change, as I mentioned already, where kind of there's been at least, in some kind of forms of legalities and stuff like that, less discrimination in terms of things like the White Australia policy, gay liberation movements, equal opportunity acts. Again, the way that those laws kind of play out in practice don't really engender equality, but at least the argument here is this kind of feeling, this governmental kind of feeling that there's more choice. Certainly the dominance of technology, science, medical and stuff like that has opened up more kind of affordances for the way people live. We're living longer, we're connecting with more people around the world. There's people can change gender and stuff like that. So this kind of frees up choices in terms of those detraditionalization processes. Related to globalization, there's the cheapness of consumer products. So much sociology looks at the way now we kind of identify ourselves more as consumers than workers. We kind of piece together that narrative of the self in terms of the things that we like and the things that we buy, more so than defining ourselves sometimes on career. Again, there's a kind of real tension there because others argue that like now we define ourselves in our career so much, we invest ourselves into that becomes our life as well. So there's a kind of playoff between those things. And also the way that media, advertising, and certainly the internet and digital world becomes a kind of key ways that we live our life. Some people argue now that we lead a media life, that much of our life plays out online or through the media, and it makes little sense to make distinctions between, the online world and the IRL, that they're kind of largely intertwined these days. So there's been this huge amount of social changes that have happened over the past, 4 decades that leads to these kind of different ways that people feel in the world, the way that their being is affected. So in terms of transitions, what has all this social, economic, political, cultural change meant? I think, as I outlined earlier, that much more higher levels of youth unemployment and casualisation, precarity, gig work kind of stuff now dominates, not just for young people, but across the labour market as a whole, but it affects young people a lot more intensely. They're exposed to those risks at a greater level than those that are older in the labour market. There's many more people now participating in education. Higher education numbers are high, a larger percentage of the population attend university. And in the correlation to that, there's been what's called the upward credentialising of the labour market. Jobs in the past that didn't need, university degrees now do. So people are kind of increasingly studying, and they're studying kind of for more of their lives. You study, you get a job, then you might have to go back to study. There's a kind of back and forth process rather than this linear transition. There's been many changes to government support for young people. It's harder and harder now to get any kind of welfare. They're constantly changing, the level of money that parents have to have lower and lower. So, you can get less and less. The time spans are shorter, all that kind of stuff. And there's kind of the entrenchment of youth wages as well. It's kind of legislated discrimination when it comes to youth wages. If you're young, apparently you just deserve to be paid less, even though you kind of may be doing the same work. So this kind of leads to all those prolonged transitions. And I'm only focusing here on the school to work stuff. There's the kind of domestic and housing stuff as well that have been parts of the other parts of the course. The key theorist to think about the inequalities in this has been Bourdieu, who's made an appearance quite a lot throughout the course already. Those that have studied, sociology already and are into their 3rd year or in the social science program would have had a lot of Bourdieu already. So I'm just going to do a very quick overview here, Bourdieu essentially is interested in the way that class functions, and not moving beyond just the economic inequalities, the way that those economic inequalities become embedded in culture, and the way that culture itself becomes a kind of hierarchy that kind of maps on to economic inequality, but not kind of completely, not just kind of shadowing it as a whole, but like has kind of strong homologies and correlations with economic inequalities. So what Bourdieu is interested in is the way that kind of we're socialized in a particular kind of place in that hierarchy, and that instills in us what he calls a habitus, a way of being and feeling and seeing in the world that affects the way that we kind of make judgments and choices, the way that we think of others, the way that we engage with institutions. So education is a key area where this has kind of been studied, and Bourdieu's own research kind of and his own development of these concepts happened with research on education. And for instance, he shows that, like, you know, there's the reason that kind of kids from working class backgrounds don't do as well at school that middle class backgrounds has nothing to do with kind of meritocracy or innate ability or anything like that. It has to do with kind of class inequalities in terms of the education system itself. The education system is set up for middle class tastes, middle class dispositions, and essentially kids from more disadvantaged backgrounds have to come into those institutions and almost learn to be a different person. So this critique of the education system thoroughly challenges the very idea of meritocracy that we'll get into in the next part of the lecture. So Bourdieu kind of talks about this notion of cultural capital, the way that that kind of socialization process sets us up with various tools, various ways of knowledge, various ways of seeing the world that allows us to feel and be more comfortable in some parts of society than others, and particularly in more legitimate, important kind of fields. The possession of cultural capital lubricates success in terms of, you know, getting a good job and knowing the right people and all that kind of thing. So that very broadly, that's the way that Bourdieu is thinking about the kind of how inequality works, while obviously having money in the right house and the right stuff and living in the right area and all that kind of stuff is very important, and a key way that cultural capital is disseminated. The cultural capital itself is kind of somewhat separated from the finances as well, particularly because middle class families, not necessarily really rich, but kind of middle in terms of economic capital, but maybe high in cultural capital, also have a kind of increased imprint on the world. People in professional managerial jobs, people in culture industries and teachers and academics and journalists and artists, again, not necessarily really high economic capital, but relatively high cultural capital, are the ones that get to define what's tasteful, what's moral, what's good, what's cool, what's legitimate. And so therefore their tastes become reflected in those things, so it's easier for them to kind of navigate those systems. So essentially that's Bourdieu's kind of conceptual apparatus is set up to help us think about the way that culture itself is a hierarchy, and that therefore equates advantage on some groups over others. So Bourdieu has been used extensively in youth studies, one of the key theorists really, produced really valuable work to show how class basically is still a key disseminator of many inequalities, particularly in education, and education sociology in particular is quite Bourdieusian. The studies tend to rely on habitus, field, and capital as the concepts, and Bourdieu's got many other concepts that I think are really interesting and useful to use. So you'll see in my work that I try and draw on those a little bit as well. But, you know, overall, Bourdieu has been quite useful in youth studies and is a very popular theorist. So in the kind of first reading this week, I've drawn from some of my PhD research, and these kind of, you know, comparison of ambitions and motivations here to different habitus, I think is a good way to kind of highlight how Bourdieu's work can help us think about these things. On one side there, you've got more more privileged kids talking about their ambitions, and you'll note there's like a international kind of view. They're looking out into the world and they kind of see it as something they can navigate and achieve. You know, I want to go and do work for the United Nations, and I want to kind of improve people's lives. There's a kind of missionary kind of discourse going on here, travel the world. In terms of ambitions, privileged kids tend to look more national, international level. The less privileged kids tend to have much more local level of ambition. They just want to get some material comfort because they're not really having it in their lives at the time. So kids in poverty in particular tend to just say their ambition is, you know, just to kind of have a secure place to live, maybe have a car, not have to worry about money. Notice in the more privileged kids, money and material stuff doesn't really appear because it's a given, they have it already. In terms of obstacles to achieving their ambitions, the more privileged kids tend to talk about their own individual motivations. They kind of have that more individualist thing going on. You know, motivation is to be like, oh, look, I'm pretty comfortable. I'm in a good position financially. I just need to motivate myself. I need to make the right choices and work hard. There's a kind of element of meritocracy in that. If I do the right things and work hard, my talent and stuff will play out. The second one there kind of talks about, look, I'm just going to have a gap year. I don't even really want to go to university straight away. Seems pointless. You know, there's this kind of freedom of choice there. This very idea of gap year doesn't really come up very much for less privileged kids. On the other side of things, obstacles, essentially talking about like money and social capital and cultural capital. My family's not that rich, so, you know, the imagination here is having to save money to go to uni, not just go to uni. Many of the kids in less privileged positions were kind of almost fantasizing about going to uni, and they're not sure they could even do that. Others talked about like the suburb that they live in had a really kind of low status, and when they put that on their resume, it means that their kind of resumes are put to the bottom of the pile because of that low status. So again, Bourdieu can kind of show here how the interplay between cultural and economic capital and social capital being the kind of networks that you move in, the people that you know, can help you lubricate a successful transition to adulthood. Okay, I'll leave this kind of introductory section there and I'll come back talking to Matt Munn about higher education.